Hey everyone, tonight we're going back to a Saturday morning that no longer exists, and honestly, a Saturday morning that most people alive today have never fully reckoned with. We've got 1950s Housewife up before the sun has made any firm commitments, working through a list of tasks that would make a modern productivity app weep quietly in the corner. We have got the story of Good Housekeeping magazine, a publication that sold an entire generation of American women the idea that the perfect home was one clean surface away, and nearly drove itself into scandal trying to prove it. We have got a day behind the counter of a Saturday beauty parlour, where the work was harder than it looked, and the conversation was the only thing keeping everyone going. And we have got a longer look at what those glossy Saturday morning routines were actually built on top of, the exhaustion, the economics, and the particular kind of quiet that falls over a house when the woman holding it all together finally sits down. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here, and leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. The alarm does not ring at a reasonable hour. That is the first thing to understand. It is set for somewhere between 5:45 and 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning in 1953, and when it goes off it makes a sound that is less a gentle awakening and more a small mechanical emergency. You silence it quickly, without drama, because the baby is still asleep down the hall and the older one does not need to be up for another hour. And you have learned that silence on a Saturday morning is its own kind of currency, something to be spent carefully. You lie there for exactly as long as you can afford to, which is not long, 30 seconds, maybe 45, enough to register that the ceiling is the same ceiling it was yesterday, enough to feel the particular weight of the day already beginning to organise itself in your mind, not the way a list organises, but the way water finds the lowest point in a room. You can feel where the day is going to go before you have even moved your feet. The bedroom is cool in a way that requires acknowledgement. The furnace clicked on somewhere around 3 in the morning and has been doing its best, but the best a furnace from 1947 can do is a suggestion of warmth, not a guarantee. The linoleum floor is cold under your feet when you swing your legs over the side of the bed. You have learned to keep your slippers right there, at the exact edge of the bed frame, because the alternative is 12 feet of cold linoleum between you and any kind of comfort, and on a Saturday morning in October, 12 feet might as well be a field. You're wearing a cotton nightgown that has been washed so many times it has become something softer than fabric, something closer to a suggestion of fabric, and it is not warm enough for this temperature, but it is what there is, and you slip your feet into the slippers and you stand up with the particular efficiency of someone who has stood up into cold air so many times that the body has simply stopped registering it as an obstacle. It is the temperature. You are the person in the temperature. You proceed. The hallway is quiet and a little dim, the early morning light just barely beginning to suggest itself through the small window at the end of the hall, the one that looks out over the backyard and the Andersons' fence and the maple tree that dropped half its leaves last weekend, and the other half, it seems, directly onto your back porch. You pass the children's rooms without looking in. You have learned that looking in is a risk. The baby sometimes stirs at the sound of a door, and if the baby stirs, the whole morning reorganises around that fact. You pass quietly. The kitchen, when you reach it, is yours. This is the thing about very early Saturday mornings that nobody bothers to mention when they write about domestic life in 1953, which is that for approximately 45 minutes between the time you wake up and the time the house begins to assemble itself, the kitchen belongs entirely to you, not in a sentimental way, not in a way that feels like a gift, more in the way that a workroom belongs to the person who arrives at it first, before anyone else has had the chance to scatter their needs across the available space. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. The kitchen is yours because you are the only person in it, and you will make use of that fact. You turn on the gas stove. The click of the igniter, once, twice, and then the low rush of the flame catching, blue and clean and immediate. The smell of it is so familiar that you barely register it as a smell anymore. It is simply what the morning smells like at the beginning, before the coffee, before anything else. You fill the percolator, you set it on the burner, you stand for a moment with your hands flat on the edge of the counter, and you look at the kitchen in the half-dark, the yellow walls not quite yellow yet in this light, more of a warm grey, the chrome on the Frigidaire catching a small gleam from the stove flame, the window above the sink showing the backyard in early morning blue, and you do something that you almost never do at any other hour of the day. You do nothing for 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Then the percolator starts its work and the smell of coffee begins to fill the kitchen, and the day begins in earnest, and you become again the person who has things to do, which is to say, you become yourself as this particular decade has shaped you, organised and capable, and working through a list that starts before breakfast and will not fully end until after dinner and possibly not even then. The coffee goes into a cup, cream from the bottle, no sugar, and you carry it to the kitchen table and you sit down with a small notepad that lives in the drawer next to the stove, the one with the rubber band around it and the pencil stub tucked under the rubber band, and you write down what needs to happen today. You have done this so many times that the writing is almost unnecessary. The list exists in your body already, but the writing of it gives the day a shape, a set of containers into which you can pour your hours, and containers are a kind of comfort when you have as many hours to fill as you do. The list, if you were to read it aloud to someone who did not already understand what Saturday meant in a house like this, would sound extraordinary. It would sound like the agenda for a small business. It might, in fact, be longer than the agenda for a small business. First, there is the wash. This is not a small thing. The washer is a Maytag wringer washer that lives in the basement, a machine that works hard and requires your active participation in a way that a washer in a later decade would not. You do not simply load it and walk away. You feed it. You watch it. You lift wet clothes through the wringer with a stick, careful about your fingers because the wringer will take your fingers if you give it the opportunity, and you have heard enough stories about wringer accidents to treat the thing with a steady, calibrated respect. The wash requires sorting and soaking and running through the machine in the correct order, whites first and always whites first, because the water starts clean and will not stay that way, and then the colours, and then the things that need the most careful handling. The clothes will need to be hung. If the weather is holding, and it looks like it might, you will hang them outside on the lines that run between the two posts at the back of the yard, the lines your husband put up the spring after you moved in, and the sheets will dry in the cool October air smelling of outside, which is a smell that cannot be manufactured and that no amount of fabric softener in any decade has ever convincingly replicated. If the weather turns, they will go on the wooden rack in the basement, which takes longer and produces a result that is adequate but not the same thing. Second, there is the cleaning. Saturday is cleaning day in a way that the other days of the week are not, even though the other days of the week also involve cleaning, because cleaning is not the kind of thing that stops being necessary because you did it yesterday. But Saturday has a more thorough quality to it. Saturday is when you get down on your knees with a brush and do the grout in the bathroom. Saturday is when you pull the refrigerator away from the wall and sweep behind it, finding the things that have rolled back there over the course of the week, a grape, a bottle cap, something that was possibly once a piece of cracker and is now more of a philosophical statement. Saturday is when you wash the kitchen floor on your hands and knees with a rag and a bucket of hot water and the Murphy oil soap, which smells exactly like every kitchen that has ever been cleaned, and which is doing its job as faithfully as it ever has. The dusting happens on Saturday with a thoroughness that the quick midweek pass-through does not attempt. The windowsills get wiped. The baseboards, if there is time, get their weekly inspection. The surfaces in the living room are cleared and wiped and replaced. The ceramic figurines that came from your mother, the lamp with the cream shade that always catches the dust along its pleated edge, the stack of Reader's Digests on the lower shelf of the end table. Everything is lifted and replaced. Everything is put back where it belongs. Third, there is the cooking. Saturday is baking day in this house, because Saturday is the day when there is, relatively speaking, a few more minutes in which to do it, and also because Sunday is coming, and Sunday requires a pie or a cake, or at minimum a good batch of rolls, and these things do not arrive on their own. The bread dough is already rising in a bowl covered with a dish towel, which you mixed last night before bed, because bread dough needs time, needs warmth, needs its own particular schedule which does not align with any other schedule but must be accommodated anyway. The pie filling is in the icebox, apple with a little cinnamon and a scrape of nutmeg, and the crust needs to be made from scratch, which means the Crisco and the flour and the ice water and the specific technique your mother taught you, pressing the dough just enough and no more, because overworked pie crust is the kind of failure you can taste, and that you will taste, specifically, on Sunday afternoon when everyone has a piece, and you know before anyone takes a bite. The children will need breakfast. Cream of wheat this morning, because it is Saturday, and Saturday is cream of wheat, the same way Thursday is soup and Sunday is a roast. Because routines inside a household do not just happen, they are built on purpose. Because a family that knows what to expect is a family that runs more smoothly. And a family that runs more smoothly is a day that is, if not easier, at least more predictable. And predictable is a form of control you have learned to value. Your husband will want eggs. This is not a request that will be made aloud. It is simply a fact of Saturday morning, the way the furnace clicking on is a fact and the cold linoleum is a fact. He will come downstairs around 7:30, in the clothes he wears for weekend work around the house, and he will pour his own coffee, which is a Saturday allowance, and he will sit at the table with the newspaper while you make his eggs, and this is the order of things, and you are not particularly resentful of it. Not today, because today you're in the kitchen before anyone else, and the kitchen is still yours in a way it will stop being in about 40 minutes, and you have learned to take what is yours when you have it. The coffee is good this morning. That is worth noting. Not every morning the coffee is exactly right, and this morning it is exactly right, and you hold the cup in both hands and you take one more sip before you begin the second phase of the morning, which begins with a trip to the basement and the Maytag and the beginning of the wash. The basement stairs are wooden, and they creak on the third step, always the third step, and you have learned to step to the right on the third step to avoid the worst of it. A small accommodation you make so automatically now that you do not think of it as accommodation at all, only as the way you go down the basement stairs, which is to say, slightly sideways on the third one. The basement is cold. The concrete floor, even through your slippers, is significantly colder than the linoleum upstairs. There's a string hanging from a bare bulb in the middle of the ceiling and you pull it, and the basement comes into its particular form of light, which is the light of a space that exists for utility and nothing else, and which shows you the Maytag, the ironing board folded against the wall, the shelves of canned goods your mother-in-law helped you put up in September, the row of your husband's tool hooks, the wicker laundry basket you carried down the night before. You sort the laundry into its 3 piles on the concrete floor. This is not a small task, and it is not a simple one, because laundry is not just laundry, it is information. It tells you what the week was, who was where, who spilled what, whose socks have a hole that needs darning before it becomes a larger problem. You find a small shirt with a grass stain on the front that is going to require the Fells naphtha bar and some attention before it goes into the wash, and you rub the bar against the wet stain and work it into the fabric with your thumbnail, which is one of those tasks that looks like nothing and takes exactly as long as it takes and leaves your hands smelling of that particular brown soap in a way that will still be there faintly after washing up. You do not mind the smell. You have been smelling it your whole life, on your mother's hands, on your grandmother's hands before that, and some smells are less a smell than a memory with a smell attached to it. The machine fills, you add the soap powder, Tide, in the yellow box, which took over from the old soap flakes that your mother still prefers and which is, whatever anyone says about it, simply easier and simply better, which is the kind of thing you only admit to yourself in the basement at 6:15 in the morning when no one is around to generate an opinion about it. The machine begins its cycle with the low, mechanical enthusiasm of a thing that knows its job and is doing it, and you stand there for a moment in the basement light listening to the sound of it, the agitator working through the water, the particular rhythmic churn that is the sound of Saturday in this house, the same way coffee percolating is the sound of Saturday in this house, and then you go back upstairs because the day has more to it than the washing, and the washing will manage itself for the next few minutes without you. Upstairs now the light has changed. It is past 6:30, and the October sun, which has finally committed to rising, is coming through the kitchen window at a low angle that hits the chrome on the Frigidaire and the chrome edge of the toaster, and makes the kitchen look for exactly this 20-minute window, like something from a magazine. You have noticed this before. The morning light at this angle has a way of making the kitchen look like someone else's kitchen, the kind you see in the pages of Better Homes and Gardens, and then the light moves and it is your kitchen again, which is also fine, which is entirely fine, but you notice the moment and you file it away somewhere that does not have a name. The bread dough has been rising under its cloth for the better part of an hour now, and it has done what bread dough does when treated correctly, which is to become something almost animate, something that has expanded with a kind of quiet ambition inside the bowl and is now waiting, at the edge of where waiting ends and impatience begins, to be turned out and shaped. You flour the board, which is the wooden board that fits over the section of the counter to the left of the stove, and that has the particular surface of a thing used every week for years, smooth in the centre and slightly rough at the edges, and you turn the dough onto it. Bread dough at this stage has a temperature and a texture that is one of the more quietly satisfying things in the domestic world, a claim you would never make aloud because it sounds like precisely the kind of thing you're supposed to feel, like a line from one of those magazine articles about the rewards of home life, but it is also simply true. The dough is warm and elastic, and it pushes back against your hands with a resistance that is exactly calibrated to the work of shaping it, and you fold and press and turn, and the dough accepts this and becomes, under your hands, the shapes you're making it into. 2 loaves for the pans and 1 smaller round that you will bake separately for cutting into at lunch. The oven needs to preheat. You set it to 350 degrees, and the oven, which runs a little hot on the left side, and has been running a little hot on the left side for as long as you have lived in this house, begins its own particular work. You have learned to account for the hot left side. You have learned to rotate the pans halfway through. These are the kinds of adjustments that are never written in any recipe, but that are the actual knowledge of baking, the knowledge that lives in the hands and in the memory rather than on the card in the recipe box. The pie crust comes next. Cold hands are good for pie crust, and the basement trip has ensured that your hands are very cold, which is one of the unexpected benefits of Saturday morning laundry that no one discusses, not even in the domestic science columns. You measure the flour into the bowl and cut in the Crisco with the 2-knife method your mother preferred, though you have been experimenting lately with a pastry blender your sister-in-law gave you at Christmas, a small wire tool that does the job faster and with less mess and that you have decided you prefer, a preference you hold without any particular need to announce it. The Crisco breaks into the flour in small flat pieces the size of peas, which is what you're aiming for, and the ice water goes in a tablespoon at a time, and you work the dough until it just barely comes together, just to the edge of coherent, and then you stop because the rule of pie crust is that you stop before you think you should. By 7:15, the kitchen holds the smell of coffee and raw bread dough, and the faint beginning of oven warmth, and your husband is awake because you can hear him moving in the bedroom, the particular rhythm of someone dressing with the unhurried confidence of a person whose Saturday morning has not, as of yet, involved a trip to the cold basement, or a wrestle with pie crust or a careful navigation of the 3rd stair. You do not resent this exactly. It is the shape of the day, and you know the shape of the day, and you have, over the course of several years of marriage, made a kind of peace with the fact that the shape of your Saturday and the shape of his Saturday are 2 different shapes that share a kitchen. He comes downstairs at 7:20 and pours his coffee and sits down with the paper, and you make his eggs, scrambled this morning with a little butter and the salt and pepper, and the bread goes into the oven while the eggs cook, and the pie shell goes into the icebox to rest, and by 7:45 the kitchen is running at full capacity in the particular way of Saturday mornings. 2 people, and eventually 2 children, and a meal and a list that is not getting shorter on its own. The children come down at 8, the older one first, in her nightgown with her hair in the 2 braids you put in last night, still largely intact but with the particular looseness of braids that have been slept on, and she goes directly to the table and sits and waits with the particular patience of a child who has learned that breakfast arrives in this house without needing to be demanded. The baby, carried by your husband who has collected him from the crib with the practiced ease of a man who's been doing this for 14 months, arrives in a state of morning satisfaction that is the exclusive property of people under 2 years old, a fullness of happiness that requires no particular reason and is not contingent on anything, and that you find, on good mornings, genuinely restorative to be near. Cream of wheat on the stove, a tablespoon of butter stirred in at the end, a small pour of whole milk to cool it, a sprinkle of brown sugar for the children and none for you, because you have learned that the small economies of the body are worth practicing even on Saturday, even in October, even when the pie crust is resting in the icebox and the bread smells of early warmth and the whole kitchen is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Breakfast is eaten and cleared, and the dishes go into the sudsy water in the sink, the deep porcelain sink that is one of the things you genuinely like about this house, and you wash the breakfast dishes while your husband retreats to the garage, where there is a project involving the lawnmower that has been involving the lawnmower for 3 consecutive Saturdays without visible resolution. The children take themselves to the living room where the radio is on, and the older one is explaining something to the baby with the earnest authority of a 7-year-old who has opinions about how the world works, and the kitchen is yours again for the second time this morning. Quieter now, warmer, smelling of bread, which is beginning to do the thing that bread does in an oven, filling the house with a warmth that is not just temperature. You wipe down the table, you wipe the counter, you check the bread which is not ready yet but is moving toward ready, with the steady ambition of things that have been given time and heat and the right conditions. You go back to the basement to run the first load through the wringer and get the second load started, carrying the wet whites back upstairs in the basket with the particular weight of wet laundry, which is always heavier than you expect even when you expect it. Out the back door and into the October air, which has turned cool and clean and smells of leaves and the distant particular sharpness that October air has in the Midwest, and you hang the sheets on the line with the wooden pins from the canvas bag that hangs on the first post, and the sheets take the air and billow slightly, and there is a moment here that is one of the quiet ones, a moment between the tasks, a moment where the morning shows you something that is almost beautiful, the clean white sheets against the October blue sky, the backyard still and cool, the maple leaves just visible at the corner of your eye. You do not stand there long, there is not time to stand there long, but you note it. Back inside. The bread comes out of the oven at 9:15, 2 loaves in the small round, and you tip them out of their pans onto the wire rack your mother gave you when you moved into this house. And the sound of the bread releasing from the pan has its own particular note, a soft hollow knock that means it is done correctly, that the crust has formed as it should. The bread will cool for an hour before it can be cut. This is the rule. This is non-negotiable. This is also, you have come to understand, one of the small cruelties of baking, that the thing you have made fills the house with the most compelling smell imaginable and then sits on the rack for 60 minutes, reminding everyone that it exists. The pie goes together quickly once the shell is out of the icebox, the apple filling cold and fragrant with cinnamon, the top crust rolled and laid over and crimped at the edges with the fork tines in the way you do it, which is not the same way your mother-in-law does it. Her crimping is more decorative and requires more time and produces a more impressive result, but yours is solid and even and done in under a minute, and the pie goes into the oven at 350 and the timer is set. It is now 9:40. You have been awake for 3 hours and 55 minutes. You have done the wash, 2 loads down and through the wringer, 1 hanging outside and the second in the machine cycling through. You have made breakfast for 4 people. You have mixed and baked 2 loaves of bread and 1 round. You have assembled and put in a pie. The kitchen is clean. The breakfast dishes are done and drying in the rack. The counters are clear. You have not yet cleaned the bathroom, which is on the list. You have not yet done the thorough dusting of the living room and the dining room. You have not yet wiped down the baseboards or mopped the kitchen floor, or changed the sheets on all 3 beds, which is a Saturday task, or taken the rugs outside to beat them against the porch railing, which is also a Saturday task, or ironed the things that came back from last Saturday's wash still in the ironing pile, because the ironing pile is a thing that exists in an ongoing state of partial completion, and always has and will, you have come to understand, always will. It is 9:40 in the morning on Saturday. You're not tired exactly. You're operating at the pace of someone who has been doing this long enough that the pace itself has become the baseline from which tiredness is measured. You pour a second cup of coffee, which is a small luxury, 2 cups before noon being the kind of thing you allow yourself on Saturdays, and you stand at the sink for a moment looking out the window at the sheets on the line, which are dry already at the edges in the October air, and you make a small inventory of what is left and you begin again. The bathroom is cleaned with a particular attention that the weekday wipe down does not achieve. The toilet bowl gets the brush and the powder. The sink gets the Ajax and the sponge. The chrome faucets get the cloth that lives under the sink for exactly this purpose, a worn piece of flannel that polishes chrome without scratching it. The mirror gets the vinegar solution and the newspaper, because newspaper does not streak, and this is one of those domestic facts that gets passed from mother to daughter like a recipe. A piece of practical knowledge whose origin no one can name but whose validity has been confirmed so many times over so many years that it has become simply true. The floor of the bathroom gets the wet rag on hands and knees, working from the back of the room toward the door, which is the only logical direction for washing a floor, and which requires you to back out of the room on your knees in a way that is, objectively, not dignified, but the bathroom floor is clean when you're done and dignity is a reasonable trade. Sheets are changed on all 3 beds. The baby's crib gets the flannel sheet on the bottom and the heavier blanket, because the window in the baby's room faces north, and the north room is always a few degrees colder than the rest of the house, which is the kind of thing you know now as automatically as your own name. Your own bedroom gets the good sheets, the white ones with the embroidered edge that were a wedding gift, and that you have washed and dried and ironed into a softness that is, at this point, the softness of many years of Saturdays, each wash taking a little more of the stiffness out until the sheets have become the particular kind of soft that only old linens have. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The older child's bed gets the flowered sheets, yellow flowers on white, which she chose herself from the Sears catalogue and which she is proud of in the way that 7-year-olds are proud of choices that were genuinely theirs. The dusting of the living room proceeds with the yellow cloth that has been lightly dampened, because dry dusting only moves the dust from one surface to another, and everyone who has ever cleaned anything knows this. The furniture in the living room is good furniture, a davenport and 2 matching chairs in a nubby green fabric that shows marks but cleans easily, an end table, a coffee table, your grandmother's cedar chest at the base of the window. The surfaces hold the things that have accumulated into the arrangement of your particular life. A Hummel figure that was a birthday gift, a glass ashtray used by company and cleaned between visits, a small framed photograph of your daughter at 3 years old on the porch of your parents' house squinting into the sun. You lift each thing, you wipe the surface beneath it, you put it back exactly where it was, and in doing this you enact a kind of daily archaeology of your own life, handling the objects that mark out the shape of who you are and what you value, and then replacing them as if they had never moved. Because the goal is not the movement but the cleanliness of the surface under them, and the objects go back to their places and the room settles back into itself, clean, ordered, unmoved. By 11:30 the pie is out of the oven, golden and fragrant and cooling on the rack next to the bread. The second load of laundry is through the wringer and hanging on the line beside the first load. The bathroom is clean, the beds are changed, the living room and dining room have been dusted, the kitchen floor is mopped, drying now with the particular shine of wet linoleum that will be gone in 20 minutes. But that is there now, and that you can see from the doorway where you stand for a moment, hands at your sides, not yet ready to sit but not yet moving either. It is 11:30 on Saturday morning, it is not yet noon, and you have done what you set out to do, which is what you set out to do every Saturday, which is to do all of it, before the morning is over, because the afternoon brings its own list and the evening brings its own list, and the week begins again on Monday, and the Saturday list is the foundation on which the rest of it sits. You go to the back door and you look at the laundry on the line, almost dry now in the October air. You look at the maple tree, you look at the Andersons' fence, you look at the sky, which is the deep clean blue of a cold October morning that has fully committed to being a day, and you register something that you do not have an easy word for, which is the particular feeling of a morning's work completed, a feeling that is not pride exactly, because pride implies something was uncertain, and none of this was uncertain, but something in the neighbourhood of pride, something that is the satisfaction of having done what needed doing and having done it in the time that was available, which is the closest this particular life in this particular decade is likely to get to triumph. You go inside, you put the kettle on, and you start the afternoon list. There is a specific kind of knowledge that comes from doing the same work every week for years, a knowledge that is not conceptual but physical, stored in the hands and the body rather than any part of the mind that could be asked to produce it on demand, and the Saturday morning housewife of the 1950s had this knowledge in quantities that the domestic economy of her era rarely acknowledged. The knowledge of exactly which shelf the extra tide was on, and how much was left and whether the box needed to go on the Thursday grocery list. The knowledge of which of the children's socks had developed holes that needed darning before they became unwearable and which ones were fine for another week. The knowledge of whether the chicken in the icebox would hold until Sunday or needed to be used today. A knowledge based on smell and colour and touch that was essentially the same knowledge that cooks had applied to this question for centuries, with no instrument more sophisticated than attention. The attention was constant. That is the thing about domestic management in that era that the magazine photographs could not show, and that the domestic science columns rarely addressed directly. The continuous low-level monitoring of the household that was as much a part of the work as any specific task on the list. You were always tracking several things simultaneously: the progress of the bread, the timing of the children's hunger, the state of the laundry, the approach of the afternoon's obligations, the contents of the refrigerator and the pantry and the supply closet, the condition of various household items and whether they had reached the point of requiring attention. This tracking was not effortful in the way that active problem-solving is effortful. It was ambient, woven into the background of everything else you were doing, automatic in the way that breathing is automatic, but it was also real, cognitive work, real mental labour, and it did not stop when you lay down at night, which is part of why the sleep of that particular life was sometimes not quite sufficient. The domestic management literature of the period, the household efficiency books and the home management texts that were published for women's courses and extension programs through the 1940s and 50s, attempted to formalize this ambient knowledge into systems, schedules, routines, checklists that would make the management of a household legible and rational, subject to the kind of scientific ordering that the era was applying to everything from factory production to the design of the highway system. These books were sometimes useful, particularly for women newly established in their own households, who had not yet had time to develop the intuitive knowledge that experience produces. But they also tended to miss the thing that made experienced housewives so effective, which was not the following of systems, but the internalization of the work itself to the point where the system was no longer necessary, where the knowledge lived in the body and the timing was felt rather than calculated and the judgment was immediate rather than deduced. The bread, as an example, did not need a timer in the hands of a woman who had baked enough bread to know what done smelled like, what the colour of the crust said about the state of the interior, what the specific sound of a loaf tapped on its bottom told you about whether the inside had finished the work of setting. The bread needed a timer in the hands of someone still learning, still building the knowledge, still dependent on external information to substitute for the internal information that would come with repetition. But for the woman who had been baking bread on Saturday mornings for a decade, the timer was a reminder rather than a guide, a backup system rather than the primary one, and the primary one was the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 Saturday mornings, living in her hands and her nose and her ears as a kind of domestic fluency that no magazine could fully convey and no photograph could show. This fluency was also, in its way, a form of expertise that the post-war era consistently undervalued, because it was domestic expertise rather than professional expertise, because it was acquired through practice rather than through formal credentials, and because it was held by women who were not being paid for it, and who therefore, by the accounting systems of their era, were not working. The formal home economics training that some women received, in high school courses or at universities, did attempt to document and credential this kind of expertise, to give it the institutional recognition that might make it visible as a real skill rather than a natural attribute. But the credential was itself devalued because the subject was devalued, and the subject was devalued because the people doing it were women, and because it happened in houses rather than in offices or factories. And the circular logic of these devaluations held through the post-war decades with considerable persistence. The woman doing the Saturday list did not, on a Saturday morning in October in 1953, spend much time thinking about the economics of her situation, or the social structures that made her work invisible. She was doing the work. The work was immediate and concrete and had its own internal logic that did not require external validation to be real, and she was inside that logic, navigating it with the expertise she had developed through years of practice, producing results that were solid and good and that the household depended on, and she would keep doing it next Saturday and the Saturday after that, with the same efficiency and the same competence and the same quiet, uncelebrated expertise. The pie would be good. She knew it would be good. The crust was right. She had felt it in her hands when she stopped at exactly the right moment, the moment before overworked. The filling was correctly spiced. The nutmeg measured by the scrape of a nail against the grater rather than by any teaspoon, because she had made this filling so many times that the measure lived in the muscle of her hand. The oven would perform as it always performed, with the hot left side accounted for, the pan rotated at the halfway point, the colour of the crust checked through the oven window at the 45-minute mark. She would not be wrong about any of this. That confidence, grounded in expertise, was one of the real goods of a life organised around repeated skilled work. She knew what she was doing. She had always known what she was doing. The Saturday morning was, in this sense, the most reliable part of the week, the part where the knowledge she had built over years of practice was fully adequate to the demands of the morning, where the work was not surprising or unpredictable, but was simply the work, and the work was within her competence, and the competence was something she had earned and could depend on. Not everything about the life was within her competence or within her control. There were the larger things, the economic decisions that were her husband's to make, the social expectations that arrived from outside the household and that she had not chosen, the structural arrangements of a world that had decided, before she had any say in the matter, what her contribution would be and what it would be worth, and how visible it would be allowed to be. These were real constraints, and they were not nothing, and the women who lived within them felt them as real constraints, even when they could not always name them precisely. But inside the kitchen on a Saturday morning, inside the work that the list described and that her hands knew how to do, there was a different kind of space, smaller than freedom but not nothing either. The space of competence, of doing something well and knowing it, of producing something real and solid and good from the materials the morning provided, and having it be enough for now, for this day, for the October morning that was brightening outside the kitchen window, while the bread cooled on the rack and the pie came out of the oven exactly right. There is a building that has stood, in various forms, on West 57th Street in New York City, and then on various other addresses as the organisation grew and moved and grew again, that has exerted more influence over the daily lives of American women than perhaps any other single institution of the 20th century, more than any government agency, more than any church, and considerably more than most husbands, though this last point is one the institution would never have stated aloud. The building belongs, or has belonged, to Good Housekeeping magazine, and what happened inside that building, what was tested, what was certified, what was sold, and what was quietly buried over the course of several decades, is a story about the distance between the image of American domestic life and the machinery required to produce and maintain that image, a distance that turns out to be considerable. Good Housekeeping began in 1885 in Holyoke, Massachusetts, founded by Clark Bryan, a publisher who believed that women keeping house deserved a publication devoted entirely to the practical business of running a home. The early issues were modest, earnest things, full of advice about meal planning and household management and the proper care of fabrics, written in the tone of a knowledgeable neighbour who happened to have opinions about pickling and a great deal of time to share them. The magazine found its audience quickly because the audience had been waiting, because American women keeping house in the 1880s had almost no reliable sources of tested practical information and were collectively very tired of advice that sounded authoritative and turned out not to work. There were household manuals and there were cookbooks, and there were letters exchanged between women who had figured things out through trial and expensive error. But there was no publication of any size or standing that said, explicitly and consistently, here is what actually works in a real kitchen, in a real house with real ingredients and a real budget, and we know because we tried it. Bryan tried it, or at least Bryan published people who tried it. The early Good Housekeeping ran recipes that had been tested and offered them as tested, and when a reader wrote in to say that the recipe had not worked, she would sometimes receive a response from the editorial staff explaining what might have gone wrong and how to correct it. And this back and forth between the magazine and its readers created something that most publications of that era never achieved, which was the feeling of being heard. American women running households in the late 19th century were doing work of genuine complexity and genuine consequence, feeding families on limited budgets, managing the health and cleanliness of households without running water or reliable refrigeration or any of the mechanical assistance that would begin to arrive in the next several decades, and the work was invisible in the way that essential work tends to be invisible, noticed only when it failed, taken for granted when it succeeded. Good Housekeeping at its best noticed the work, took it seriously enough to engage with it technically, and the women doing the work responded accordingly. By the time the Hearst Corporation purchased Good Housekeeping in 1911, the magazine had already become something more than a publication. It had become a voice, a trusted voice, a voice that millions of American women understood to be speaking directly to the practical conditions of their daily lives, a voice that had opinions about flour sifters and stain removal and the correct internal temperature for a properly cooked roast, and that offered those opinions in the tone of someone who had actually tested the advice before giving it. This was, in the early 20th century, a genuinely rare quality, and Hearst understood its value. Hearst also understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose primary professional skill was understanding how publications made money, that the magazine's credibility was itself a product, something that could be leveraged commercially in ways that Good Housekeeping had not yet fully pursued. What Hearst also understood was that the magazine's credibility could be sold carefully to the manufacturers who were flooding the American market with new goods, new brands, new categories of domestic product that had not existed a generation earlier. The American housewife of the 1910s and 1920s was navigating a consumer landscape of bewildering novelty, refrigerators and electric irons, and packaged breakfast cereals and washing machines and canned goods and 100 varieties of cleaning product, all of them claiming to be the best, most of them untested by anyone with any credibility. Into this landscape, Good Housekeeping positioned itself as the institution that would do the testing, that would apply a rigorous scientific standard to the claims manufacturers were making, and report honestly on whether those claims held up. Whether a soap powder did what it claimed, whether a baking powder leavened as promised, whether a fabric treated with a particular process retained its colour through repeated washing, these were questions that American housewives were trying to answer on their own, through the expensive and exhausting method of buying the product and finding out, and Good Housekeeping offered to answer them in advance. The Good Housekeeping seal of approval was introduced in 1909 before the Hearst purchase, and it was based on a genuinely good idea. The magazine would test products, and the products that passed would earn the seal, and readers would know that a product carrying the seal had been independently evaluated by people with expertise and found to meet the claims it was making. It was, in principle, exactly the kind of honest consumer advocacy that the marketplace in that era desperately needed, and it was the kind of thing that Good Housekeeping, with its reputation and its readership and its testing infrastructure, was uniquely positioned to provide. The complication, and it arrived fairly quickly and remained for the rest of the century, was the financial one. By the 1920s and 30s, the Good Housekeeping Institute, the organization's in-house testing laboratory, had become a significant operation, staffed with home economists and chemists and researchers who did genuine work, real testing, real analysis, real reporting on what worked and what did not. The institute occupied dedicated space. It employed credentialed staff. It had equipment for fabric testing and product analysis and kitchen evaluation, and the women and men who worked in it took their work seriously and brought real scientific training to bear on the questions they were asked to address. The institute was not a fiction, it was a real thing doing real work. But the institute also existed inside a magazine that depended on advertising revenue, and advertisers were, increasingly, the manufacturers whose products the institute was testing, and this created a tension that the organisation would struggle with, in various ways and with varying degrees of honesty, for the duration of its commercial life. To carry the seal, a company needed to advertise in the magazine. This was presented carefully as a separate administrative matter, unrelated to the actual testing process. A product would be tested on its merits, the magazine maintained, and the advertising relationship was simply the mechanism by which the company paid for the ongoing monitoring that the seal's guarantee required. In the ideal version of the system, and there were genuine believers in the ideal version, both inside and outside the organisation, the two processes were entirely independent. A product could fail testing regardless of whether its manufacturer was a paying advertiser. A product that passed testing earned the seal on the strength of its performance, not the size of its advertising budget. In practice, the situation was more complicated. Not because the testing was invented, but because the relationship between the testing laboratory and the advertising department occupied the same building and served the same institutional interests, and because the magazine had powerful incentives that did not always align with adversarial honesty about the products of its largest advertisers. There were internal reports, over the decades, of pressure applied to researchers when their findings reflected badly on important accounts. There were categories of product where the testing was more rigorous and categories where it was less so, and the difference did not always track neatly with scientific importance. There were products that carried the seal for years without being meaningfully re-evaluated, because re-evaluation created the possibility of findings that would require the seal to be withdrawn, which would require a conversation with an advertiser that nobody particularly wanted to have. The women who worked in the Good Housekeeping Institute were, for the most part, not party to these strategic decisions and not particularly comfortable with the arrangements they occasionally glimpsed. They were scientists and home economists who had trained seriously in their fields, many of them graduates of the home economics programs that universities across the country had established in the early 20th century, programs that treated domestic science as a legitimate academic discipline requiring real scientific understanding, real chemistry, real materials science, real nutrition. These women had credentials, they had standards. They pushed back when a product did not perform and documented their findings with care, and maintained whatever independence the institutional structure around them allowed. They were also women working in a professional capacity in an era when professional women were regarded with a certain ambient skepticism, operating within an organisation whose senior leadership was male, and whose bottom line was commercial, and they understood with the clarity that comes from occupying a position of relatively limited institutional power, that the work they did existed in service of something larger than the work itself. The Institute's test kitchen became, in the post-war years, a kind of celebrity destination. It was photographed regularly for the magazine and for promotional materials, and the photographs show exactly what you would expect from 1950s promotional materials about a test kitchen, which is gleaming surfaces and professional-looking women in white lab coats and pristine appliances and the entire vocabulary of scientific modernity applied to the domestic sphere. These photographs served a purpose beyond documentation. They told a story about what good housekeeping was and what the seal meant, and the story they told was one of rigorous, independent, expert evaluation conducted in conditions of scientific exactitude by trained professionals who had no interest other than the truth. The story was not entirely false. The kitchens were real, the women were credentialed, the equipment was genuine. The testing that happened in those kitchens produced real results about real products. What the photographs did not show, because photographs never show what they do not show, was the advertising relationship, the commercial infrastructure, the long and complicated history of decisions made in offices that were not the test kitchen about what the seal would mean and who would have access to it, and what would happen when the findings were inconvenient. They did not show the gap between the independent testing institution the magazine presented itself as being and the commercially integrated operation it actually was. The 1950s were the magazine's peak years in terms of cultural influence. American women were keeping house in the post-war consumer paradise, surrounded by new products and new appliances and new categories of domestic need that the advertisers were busy creating alongside the products meant to address them. And Good Housekeeping sat at the centre of this world with the authority of a trusted institution and the circulation numbers to back it up. The magazine's circulation in the mid-1950s was somewhere above 4 million copies monthly, making it one of the largest circulation publications in the country, and the women reading those copies were the same women purchasing the products advertised in those copies, and the seal that appeared on those products represented, in their understanding, the magazine's expert endorsement based on rigorous independent testing. This was the understanding the magazine had worked hard to create and worked hard to maintain, because the understanding was worth money, significant money, the kind of money that kept the Institute running, and the test kitchens staffed, and the offices on West 57th Street operating at the level a Hearst publication operating in the post-war era was expected to operate. The credibility of the seal was the magazine's most valuable commercial asset, which is a statement that contains its own irony, because the asset was credibility, and the thing most threatening to that asset was the kind of scrutiny that credibility is supposed to be able to withstand. The Federal Trade Commission examined Good Housekeeping's practices in 1939 and found aspects of the seal's presentation misleading, specifically the suggestion that the seal constituted a guarantee in the full legal sense of that word, when what it actually constituted was a conditional promise backed by the magazine itself rather than by any independent consumer authority. If a product carrying the seal failed to perform as described, Good Housekeeping had represented that it would refund the reader's money or replace the product, but the terms of this commitment were not always as clear in the advertising as they were in the small print, and the FTC concluded that the overall impression created by the seal and its surrounding promotional language was not entirely accurate. Good Housekeeping adjusted its language and continued operating, with modifications that satisfied the FTC's immediate concerns while preserving the fundamental commercial arrangement. In 1971, the FTC looked again, with an eye toward both the advertising relationship and the guarantee claims, and found again that the presentation of the seal created impressions about independence and rigour that were not fully supported by the actual institutional arrangements. Good Housekeeping adjusted again and continued. The seal survived both examinations in modified form and remained a feature of American consumer life, changed somewhat in its specific claims and language, but carrying forward the fundamental authority that 3/4 of a century of association with domestic expertise had built into it. What matters, when you think about the women reading Good Housekeeping in 1953, sorting through its pages at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, while the bread baked and the laundry turned in the machine downstairs, is that the magazine gave them something they genuinely needed and had few alternatives for finding: a source of domestic information that claimed to be tested, that felt authoritative, that spoke to the specific practical conditions of their daily lives, that took the work they were doing seriously enough to have an opinion about it, a documented, researched, expert-backed opinion. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. Whether those opinions were always arrived at through processes as clean as the magazine suggested is a different question from whether the women reading the magazine were well served by having a source that addressed their work with apparent expertise. And the answer to that second question, even taking full account of the commercial complications, is that for many of them, in many areas, they were. The recipe for the cake that turned out correctly was a real recipe. The advice about removing a red wine stain that actually worked was real advice. The comparison of 2 washing powders that accurately identified one as superior was accurate. The home economists in the test kitchen were real professionals doing real work, and their work reached the magazine's readers in ways that genuinely helped those readers do theirs. The system that delivered this help was commercially compromised in ways the readers did not fully understand, but the help itself was often real, and in the 1950s, in a domestic world of increasing complexity and increasing consumer choice, real help with the practical work of keeping a home was not a small thing. There was also something else Good Housekeeping gave its readers, something that does not appear on any list of the magazine's services or in any of the FTC's examination reports, which is the feeling that the work mattered, that the specific, detailed, technical business of keeping a house was worthy of expert attention, of institutional investment, of a well-staffed laboratory and a credentialed staff, and a monthly publication of several hundred pages. In an era when the cultural message to women was simultaneously that keeping house was their highest calling, and that keeping house required no particular intelligence or expertise, only instinct and dedication, Good Housekeeping quietly communicated something different. It communicated that the work was complex enough to require testing, varied enough to require ongoing research, important enough to be worth the attention of trained professionals with real equipment and documented standards. That message, whatever its commercial complications, was true, and it was not a message that women received from very many other places. The gleaming test kitchen in the Good Housekeeping Institute, staffed with women in white coats evaluating the performance of Crisco and the durability of nylon and the accuracy of cake mix instructions, was both a real thing and an image deployed in service of a commercial enterprise, and both of those things were true at the same time, and the tension between them is the story of American domestic consumerism in the post-war period, compressed into the pages of a monthly magazine with a circulation in the millions and a seal that people cut from advertisements and kept. That gap between the official image and the actual machinery behind it was not unique to magazines, and not unique to the publishing industry. It existed in the post-war domestic world in forms so ordinary and so close to the surface that they were nearly invisible, which is to say, they were visible to everyone who was close enough to see them and invisible to everyone who was not, and that division followed fairly neatly along lines of labour. The people doing the work knew what the work actually was, and the people consuming the image of the work often knew something rather different. And nowhere was that gap more present, more constant, and more carefully maintained than in the spaces where women gathered on Saturday mornings to perform the rituals of beauty that the post-war era had elevated to something close to a civic obligation, The corner beauty parlour in 1953 was a place of considerable significance in the social life of an American town, a weekly institution as embedded in the schedule as church on Sunday and the grocery run on Thursday. And what happened inside it, from the counter where the appointments were taken to the chairs where the setting was done, was more complicated and more interesting than the cheerful magazine illustrations of smiling women under dryers ever quite managed to convey. But to understand it from the inside, you first had to work there. It is worth pausing here before we move to the beauty parlour to understand the specific texture of what Good Housekeeping meant to its readers in ways that go beyond the commercial and the institutional. Because the magazine arrived in households that were conducting, every week, the same kind of reckoning that the housewife doing her Saturday list understood intimately, the reckoning between what was expected and what was possible, between the ideal and the actual, between the image on the magazine cover and the reality in the kitchen at 6:30 on a cold October morning. Good Housekeeping presented a particular version of domestic life. Its pages were full of photographs of rooms that were clean in a way that real rooms with real children in them were not clean, of tables set with a precision and elegance that required an amount of time and attention and expense that most of its readers were not managing on a Tuesday evening after work and school, and the grocery run. The food in its photographs was perfect, which is to say, it had been prepared by professional food stylists for photographic purposes, rather than by tired women in actual kitchens making dinner for families with opinions about vegetables. The houses in its photographs had a sufficiency of closet space and a quality of light that the actual houses of its actual readers rarely matched. And yet the readers came back every month. The subscription list grew rather than shrank. The letters to the editor expressed not irony or resentment at the gap between the images and their own lives, but something more like aspiration, an attachment to the image as a thing worth working toward, a version of home life that they understood to be idealized, but that they found useful to imagine approaching, even if they knew they would not quite arrive. The magazine gave them a picture of what their work was for, a picture of the destination that the Saturday list and the basement laundry and the pie crust, and the stripped and remade beds were all moving toward, and the picture was beautiful enough to be motivating even when they understood on some level that it was also not quite true. This is not a cynical reading of Good Housekeeping's relationship with its readers. It is an honest one. The women who read the magazine were not deceived by it in any simple sense. They understood that the photographs were composed and the recipes were tested under optimal conditions, and the home management advice was written by people who had not recently spent 45 minutes on their knees scrubbing a bathroom floor. They were intelligent women navigating a complex domestic world with the tools available to them, and Good Housekeeping was one of those tools, imperfect and commercially complicated but genuinely useful, in ways that the women who used it understood better than anyone who had not done the work. The magazine also documented something that would otherwise have gone entirely undocumented. The recipes, the product reviews, the advice columns, the home economics features, taken together, constitute a remarkably detailed record of what American domestic life actually involved in the mid-20th century, what people ate and how they prepared it, what products filled their pantries and medicine cabinets and linen closets, what standards were expected in a well-run home and who was expected to meet them, and how. Historians of everyday life in post-war America return to Good Housekeeping repeatedly, precisely because it contains a level of specific, practical, textured detail about the daily work of keeping a household that official records and demographic surveys and newspaper archives do not provide. The magazine cared about the details. It sent writers to investigate the details. It published the details in a form that millions of readers found useful and kept, in some cases for years, consulting the recipes long after the issues were outdated and the products reviewed no longer available. The seal may have been complicated. The advertising relationships were not simple. The editorial independence was imperfect in the ways that commercial editorial independence is always imperfect. But the magazine also left behind something that the women inside those test kitchens would recognize as genuinely valuable, which is a record of what the work actually was, specific and detailed and taken seriously, photographed and tested and described in sufficient detail that you can, reading the issues today, reconstruct in your mind the precise texture of what it smelled and felt and looked like to keep a house in 1953, to stand in a kitchen on a Saturday morning with a list and a percolator and the sound of a Maytag turning in the basement, and to work through all of it before noon. The Good Housekeeping Institute also had a particular relationship with American women professionals that is worth understanding on its own terms, separate from the commercial complications that surrounded its public role. For women who graduated from home economics programs in the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s, institutions like the Good Housekeeping Institute represented one of the relatively few places where women with scientific training and domestic expertise could work in a professional capacity that was taken seriously, paid a professional salary, and given real responsibilities that required real skill. The alternatives were limited. A home economics graduate who wanted to work in a field adjacent to her training had a small number of options available to her: teaching, extension work with the agricultural department, corporate consumer research, or the staffs of publications and institutions like Good Housekeeping. The Institute was, by the standards of its era, a desirable professional destination, one where the work was real and the expertise was valued and the staff were regarded as authorities in their fields. Women who worked there in the post-war years described the experience with considerable ambivalence in the memoirs and oral histories that survive. On one hand, the work was technically interesting, genuinely demanding, and treated as serious. The Institute expected its staff to bring real scientific rigour to their evaluations, to document their methods carefully, to write their findings clearly and accurately. On the other hand, the staff were also aware that their findings existed within a commercial context that sometimes made the findings complicated, that the research they did was not purely independent scientific inquiry, but institutional research in service of a specific commercial enterprise with specific commercial interests that did not always align with scientific honesty. Most of them navigated this with the practical sophistication of professional women who understood the system they were working within and were choosing to work within it, because the alternatives were fewer and the work was better than the alternatives, which is also a perfectly reasonable set of priorities to have. What none of them doubted, even the most critically minded, was that they were doing something that mattered to the women who read the results. The home economists in the test kitchen who figured out why a particular cake mix produced a dense texture and wrote up their findings clearly enough that a reader in Tulsa or Davenport could understand and correct the problem, they were doing something genuinely useful. The researchers who tested washing powders and found that one removed stains more effectively at lower temperatures and published those findings in language accessible to someone who had never taken a chemistry course. They were bridging a gap between technical knowledge and practical application in ways that helped real people do real work better. That was worth something. It was worth considerably more than the commercial complications around it sometimes made it look. There was also, underneath the commercial apparatus and the advertising relationships and the FTC examinations, a genuine ideological commitment running through Good Housekeeping's history, inconsistently honoured and imperfectly maintained but present nonetheless, to the idea that keeping a house well was work that deserved the same kind of expert attention and documented standards that any other kind of skilled labour received. In a culture that simultaneously insisted that any woman could keep a good house by instinct, and that a woman who did not keep a good house had failed at her fundamental purpose, Good Housekeeping offered a quietly radical alternative view, which was that keeping a house well was a skill, learnable and improvable, that benefited from good information and tested technique, and that the women doing it deserved the same quality of practical guidance that a builder received from an architect or a mechanic received from an engineering manual. That idea was not always consistently applied and was never entirely free of the commercial interests that funded the magazine, but it was present in Good Housekeeping's best work, in the test kitchen findings and the product evaluations and the home management features written by women who had studied the subject seriously and were sharing what they had learned. It is a complicated legacy, which is the honest assessment of almost every institution that existed at the centre of post-war American domestic life. Because the centre of post-war American domestic life was itself a complicated place, built on ideals that were genuine and expectations that were impossible, and aspirations that were beautiful and arranged to serve economic interests that the women inside the system were largely not being asked about. Good Housekeeping both reflected the complexity and participated in it, and the women who worked there and the women who read it were all doing something similar, which was finding the usefulness available within a system not of their own design, and making of it what they could. That is, in the end, what the Saturday Morning List was also doing, finding the usefulness available within the system, getting done what needed doing, producing something by noon that was real and solid and good, even if no one would photograph it, even if no magazine would run a seal of approval on the morning's work, even if the only one who would know the full extent of what had been accomplished was the person who had done it, standing at the back door in October air, looking at clean sheets on the line. You know before you open the door that it is going to be a full day, not because of the schedule, though the schedule is already written on the appointment book in your handwriting, and it runs from 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon with very little white space visible. You know it because it is Saturday, and Saturday at a beauty parlour in a medium-sized American town in 1953 is a different category of workday from any other day, a day with its own particular rhythm and its own particular pressures and its own particular rewards, which are modest but real and which require getting through a great deal of work to reach. The parlour opens at 8. You're there at 7:15 because the place needs to be ready before the first appointment arrives, and ready means a specific set of things that do not arrange themselves. The towels need to be folded and stacked on the shelf above the sink stations. The perm solution bottles need to be checked for levels, and the ones that are low need to be refilled from the larger supply in the back room. The permanent wave rods need to be sorted into their sizes, and their sizes are important because a woman who comes in for a tight curl and receives a large rod wave will know the difference immediately and will mention it. And a woman who mentions it to everyone she sees on Monday will cost you appointments you needed. The rollers need to be separated by size and placed in the trays at each station. The setting lotion needs to be mixed, lilt or tony depending on what is in stock, and the mixing ratio matters. Too much and the set is too stiff, too little and it will not hold through the week, and you have been mixing it for long enough that you do it by feel and by smell rather than by the number of capfuls, which is a kind of knowledge that takes time to develop and that you are quietly proud of having developed. The floor gets swept before anyone arrives, because the floor of a beauty parlour is a place where hair accumulates with a determination that defies the previous day's sweeping. There is always more hair, curling on the linoleum in the particular light of early morning, silver and brown and the occasional brave red, evidence of yesterday's work lying on the floor where it fell, and you sweep it into the dustpan and into the wastebasket, and you're not sentimental about it because hair on the floor of a beauty parlour is simply the byproduct of the work, and the work produces byproducts. This is the nature of the work, and sentiment about hair on a floor is a luxury you do not have time for on Saturday morning. The chair at your station gets adjusted. You have a particular client at 8 whose back gives her trouble, and who needs the chair at a height slightly lower than the default, and you know this because you have been doing her hair for 4 years, and because she told you once about the back and you wrote a small note to yourself on her card, the card that lives in the box behind the front counter, with every other client's card, the box that is the organisational centre of the whole business, the record of who comes when and what they have and what they prefer and what they are allergic to, and what they complained about the last time, and what made them happy the time before that. The cards are not elegant. They are index cards with handwriting on them, some of the handwriting yours and some of it from the owner, who started the parlour in 47 and who works Tuesdays through Fridays and leaves Saturdays to you and to Doris, who is the other operator, and who will arrive at 7:45 with her coat still on and her hat not yet removed, and who will have her station ready in 8 minutes regardless, because Doris has been doing this longer than you and has the efficiency of someone for whom all the preparatory steps have become so automatic they are barely steps anymore. Doris arrives at 7:43, the hat comes off at 7:44, her station is ready at 7:52. She pours herself a cup of coffee from the percolator in the back room, which you already started because you knew she would want it, and she says good morning, and you say good morning, and the two of you stand in the quiet of the parlour for exactly as long as there is quiet to stand in, which is until the first client arrives at 8:02. The first client is Mrs. Halverson, who has been coming on Saturday morning since before you started working here, and whose hair you did not do until your 3rd week. When the owner felt you were ready and put Mrs. Halverson in your chair, with the confidence of someone transferring a responsibility she trusted you to handle. Mrs. Halverson has thin, fine silver hair, and she wants it done exactly the same way every week, which is rolled on small rods, set under the dryer for 22 minutes, not 20 and not 25, brushed out gently and then combed into the specific style she's been wearing since approximately 1946, and which she intends, you understand without being told, to continue wearing for the remainder of her life, This is not a limitation. This is a working relationship. You know what she wants, you know how to produce it, and producing it correctly is your job, and you do it correctly. You shampoo her first. The shampoo sink is behind your station, and Mrs. Halverson reclines into it with the ease of long practice, her neck in the cradle of the sink's neck rest, her eyes closed as soon as the warm water begins. You have seen women fall nearly asleep during the shampoo, which is not uncommon, because the combination of warm water and the sensation of someone else's hands working through the hair produces a relaxation that is difficult to achieve by other means, and that many of your clients do not find available to them anywhere else in their week, and you understand this. And you are careful with the shampoo, not cursory, not rushed in the way that a busy Saturday morning makes you want to rush every step that is not the step with the obvious time pressure on it, but attentive, because the shampoo is part of the service and the service is what they are paying for. And what they are paying for is not just the hair, but the 45 minutes or the hour in which someone is paying careful attention to them and their comfort, and that is worth doing correctly. Mrs. Halverson's hair goes in the rods, small rods, as always, the ones in the second tray from the left. The setting lotion goes on first, work through the wet hair section by section, and then the rods, each section wound with the particular tension that her fine hair requires, not too tight or it will break, not too loose or the curl will not form, and you wind with the practiced speed of someone who has set many hundreds of heads of hair and for whom the motion is stored in the hands rather than the mind. The first few times you set a head, years ago now, you were thinking consciously about each section, its placement, its tension, the angle of the rod. Now you are listening to Mrs. Halverson tell you about her daughter's new kitchen, which the daughter installed in August with a built-in dishwasher that Mrs. Halverson finds extravagant, but that her daughter insists is practical, and you're responding appropriately, asking the right questions, and your hands are doing the rods without requiring your attention, which is the kind of competence that looks like nothing from the outside and is in fact the result of considerable accumulated work. The dryer hood comes down over Mrs. Halverson's rods at 8:22, 22 minutes on the timer. She picks up the magazine from the rack beside the dryer, Ladies' Home Journal or Collier's, or the People magazine equivalent of its era, and she begins the weekly ritual of reading under the dryer, which is a ritual so specifically Saturday morning that you cannot think of it without thinking of Saturday morning, the particular visual of a row of women under the curved hoods of the standing dryers, each one in her own bubble of warm air and noise, each one reading or talking to the neighbour in the next dryer with the slightly raised voice that the dryer noise requires, each one in the particular social state of being at the beauty parlour, which is a state that has no precise equivalent elsewhere in the week. Your next appointment arrives at 8:30 while Mrs. Halverson is under the dryer. This is Mrs. Patterson, who is younger and wants a different result, a permanent wave to add body to her naturally straight hair, and a permanent wave on a Saturday morning is a different kind of work from a simple set and style, a longer commitment, a more precise chemistry, a process that requires your attention at intervals throughout its duration, rather than a clean handoff to the dryer and then a focus on the next client. The perm rods go in first, larger than Mrs. Halverson's, and you have learned to do this precisely because an imprecise perm is a disaster that will announce itself in several days when the wave develops unevenly and the client calls, and a client who calls about an uneven perm is a conversation you do not enjoy, and that is entirely preventable by doing the rods correctly the first time. The solution goes on. It smells the way it always smells, which is the smell that defines a beauty parlour in 1953 as distinctly as anything else. The chemical sweetness of the waving lotion that no amount of ventilation entirely removes, and that you have been breathing for long enough that you barely register it, though clients who are not used to it often comment on it when they come in, wrinkling their noses slightly before they also stop noticing it. You time it carefully. The ammonia-based solutions of this era work quickly and work definitely, which is another way of saying they are not forgiving of extended contact time, and you watch the clock with the particular attention of someone who has seen what happens when the solution is left on too long, and who has no interest in seeing it again. Mrs. Halverson comes out of the dryer at 8:44, 2 minutes past her 22, because you were in the middle of sectioning Mrs. Patterson, and the clock slipped by you, which you note with the quiet self-reproach of someone who cares about the details and who does not enjoy the moments when the details get away from her. You remove Mrs. Halverson's rods with the focused speed of experience, and seat her at your station and begin the brush out, which for her fine silver hair is a gentle process, the brush moving through the softened curl carefully to avoid breakage, pulling the wave into its intended shape without destroying the structure the rods created. Her hair complies. It is not always so cooperative. Today it is doing what you want, responding to the brush the way it should, becoming the neat, regular wave it always becomes on the Saturdays when everything goes right. The comb out is fast. You have done this particular style so many times that the comb moves in patterns your hands know without instruction, lifting here, pressing there, creating the small, precise architecture of a woman's hair in a particular set style in a particular decade, which is its own kind of design work, its own kind of technical craft, the result of which will be visible to Mrs. Halverson every time she looks in a mirror until next Saturday. She inspects the result in the hand mirror with the careful attention of someone who knows what she's looking for and who has standards and who will tell you if those standards have not been met. And then she nods, which means it is right. And she reaches for her handbag and you remove the cape from her shoulders and shake it out and rehang it for the next client. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. She tips you 40 cents. This is not a comment on the quality of the work, it is what she has always tipped, and you have adjusted your assessment of it to understand that 40 cents from Mrs. Halverson in 1953 is a fixed price for a fixed service, and is not going to vary with the excellence of the brush out or the attentiveness of your listening. And that is all right, because consistency is its own kind of information, and you know what to expect from Mrs. Halverson in the same way that Mrs. Halverson knows what to expect from you, which is a working relationship that functions because both parties understand their roles. Doris, at her station, is finishing a set on a woman you do not know, a client of Doris's who comes in from the other end of town, and who Doris has been doing since before either of you started here, a woman of perhaps 60 with dyed auburn hair that is not quite convincing, but that is maintained with a commitment that represents either real vanity or real necessity, and probably both, because those two things are rarely as separate as people assume. Doris's hands move with the efficiency she was noting as her defining professional quality from the moment you first saw her work. No wasted motions, no hesitations, the comb finding its angle and the fingers placing the pin curl exactly where it will achieve the result she has in mind before it has quite fully registered in her conscious attention that she has made a decision. The parlour fills up by 9:30. This is Saturday, and by 9:30 on Saturday the rhythm of the place has found its full speed. The dryer's running, the sink's occupied, the station's busy, the appointment book moving through its entries at the pace of work that is proceeding as it should, which is quickly and without incident. The sound of a beauty parlour at full Saturday speed is its own distinct music. The low hum of the dryers, the sound of water running in the shampoo sink, the voices of women talking, the particular metallic click of roller trays being set down and picked up, the scissors, the combs, the chemical smell underneath everything like a low note in a chord that holds the whole together. You are doing Mrs. Kowalski's permanent wave neutralizer when the conversation at Doris's station touches something worth noting. The two women in the dryers, Mrs. Patterson waiting for her perm to process, and another client of Doris's under the neighbouring dryer, are discussing, at the slightly elevated volume the dryer noise requires, a conversation about a neighbour who has been seen in town with a young man who is not her husband, and the conversation has the quality of all beauty parlour conversations about this category of topic, which is that it is conducted in the vocabulary of concern and community standards, but carries a charge that is something between fascination and judgment and genuine worry, the three of which are so entangled in this particular mode of small-town female social life that pulling them apart would require an expertise nobody in the beauty parlour is applying. You listen without appearing to listen, which is a skill you developed early in this work and that you regard as essential, because a beauty parlour is a place where things are said that are not said elsewhere, and the things said there are said precisely because the people saying them feel that the beauty parlour is a space apart, a space where the social rules are slightly relaxed by the peculiar intimacy of the arrangement. A woman in a chair letting someone else touch her hair and work through it, which is an act of physical trust that opens something, that creates the conditions for a kind of candour that the grocery store or the church fellowship hall does not create. Things are confessed in beauty parlours. Problems are aired. Worries are given voice that have not been spoken to anyone else. Grievances are laid out on the table between the curling iron and the setting lotion and examined in the particular light of female company and then folded up and put back away. And nobody is required to do anything with what was said, only to have heard it, only to have witnessed it, which is sometimes the only thing that was needed. You do not repeat what you hear. This is not a rule that was explained to you when you started working here. It is a rule that was understood, the way the mixing ratio for setting lotion was understood, through the combination of training and observation, and the clear comprehension of consequences, because a beauty parlour operator who repeats what is said under her dryers is a beauty parlour operator who will have fewer clients in 6 months, and the clients who leave will not say why, only that they have decided to try somewhere else, and the somewhere else will be the parlour across town whose operator knows when to keep quiet. By 11, the appointment book has moved through 8 clients between you and Doris, and the pace has not let up. There is no late morning lull on a Saturday the way there sometimes is on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Saturday is the day people have arranged for, saved for in some cases, looked forward to during a week of work that offered few enough small luxuries. The set and the style and the 45 minutes under a dryer with a magazine is, for many of these women, the most deliberately pleasurable thing in their week. The thing they chose for themselves rather than chose in service of someone else, and they arrive with the particular alertness of people approaching an event they have been anticipating. You learn things about people in this chair, not because they confide in you, though sometimes they do, but because hair is honest in ways that people are not. A woman whose hair has been breaking at the ends has been using too much heat, or sleeping on rollers that are too tight, or both, and you notice it before she sits down. A woman whose scalp is inflamed is under stress, or has been washing with the wrong product, or both. A woman whose colour has grown out beyond the point where she would normally have been in to see you has been managing something that left no time for a beauty parlour appointment. And you note this without comment, because the comment is not your place. But you are gentle with the grown-out roots, and you do not make her wait any longer than necessary for the result. There is a lunch break, technically, from noon to 12:30. In practice, it's a 20-minute break in which you eat the sandwich you brought from home, sitting in the back room with Doris, the two of you eating without much ceremony, while the last client of the morning is under the dryer, and the first client of the afternoon is not yet due. Doris has a ham sandwich. You have cream cheese and olive on white bread, which is your particular preference, and which your husband finds baffling but tolerates because you make it for yourself and not for him. The coffee in the back room has been on the burner since 7:15, and is now something in the neighbourhood of aggressive, and you drink it anyway, because you have 4 afternoon appointments beginning at 12:30, and the afternoon on a Saturday has its own requirements. The afternoon follows the pattern of the morning. The clients arrive, the work proceeds, the dryers run. The conversations happen in the particular half-private space of the beauty parlour, where women are both in a public place and in a kind of suspended intimacy that the public place does not quite dissolve, and you move through it with the efficiency and the attention and the quiet professional discretion that the work requires. By 3 o'clock, your feet are making themselves known in the way that feet make themselves known after 8 hours of standing on linoleum, a low, persistent conversation about the morning and what it cost them, and whether the afternoon might possibly relent. And you listen to this conversation the same way you listen to the conversations under the dryers, with attention, but without the ability to do anything about it right now. The last appointment on Saturday is Mrs. DiMaggio, who comes in at 4:15 for a trim and a simple set, and who is quick, efficient and generous with the tip. And when she leaves at 5 minutes past 5, the parlour is yours and Doris's in the tired way that a space belongs to the people who are responsible for closing it up. You sweep the floor, Doris cleans the sinks, you fold the remaining clean towels, Doris empties the wastebaskets, the chairs are cleaned and covered, the product bottles are checked and the low ones noted for ordering. The appointment book for next Saturday is already written, 12 clients between you and Doris. The names familiar in the particular way of names you've been reading every week for the past several years. The names of women who have decided that their Saturday mornings include you, that the work you do is part of the infrastructure of their week, not optional but built in, expected and relied upon the way the furnace is relied upon, because it maintains something that matters. You leave at 5:20. The October air outside is cold in a way that is welcome after the chemical warmth of the parlour, and you stand on the sidewalk for a moment with your coat only half buttoned, feeling the cold come in around the edges of it, and you are tired in the specific way of someone who's been on their feet and attentive for 10 hours. A tiredness that is complete and earned and that will resolve, mostly with a decent night's sleep, because you're not 60 and your back has not yet filed its formal complaint. You button the coat, you walk to where the car is parked, you think briefly about what is in the refrigerator and whether it is sufficient for dinner. Saturday is over for you the same way it was over for the women whose hair you set, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the quiet completion of having done what needed doing, having done it correctly, having gotten through the list, and being, at the end of it, tired in a way that is its own kind of satisfaction. There is something else that happens on a Saturday in a beauty parlour that the schedule does not capture and that the appointment book does not record, something that exists in the margins of the work rather than at its centre, and that is the social function of the place itself, the particular role it plays in the community that it serves, which is a role that goes considerably beyond hair. A beauty parlour in a small or medium-sized American town in 1953 is, among other things, a women's space, one of the relatively few spaces in the social geography of the town that is organised around women's presence, that women enter as the primary participants rather than the supporting cast, where the expertise belongs to women and is applied in service of women, and where the conversation is shaped by women's interests and concerns, rather than by the interests and concerns of the men who are not there. This is not a trivial fact in 1953, when the rest of the social geography of the town is organised rather differently, where the barbershop is for men, and the hardware store is coded as men's territory, and the garage is emphatically men's territory, and the bar on the corner of Main and First is men's territory in practice, even if it is not formally restricted, and where women's presence in many of these spaces requires a certain amount of performance of not belonging that is exhausting in the way that performances of not belonging always are. In the beauty parlour, nobody's performing not belonging. Everyone there belongs, by definition, because belonging there is the condition of being a woman in a women's space, and the conversation that emerges from that condition is different from the conversation that emerges from mixed spaces or from spaces coded as masculine, different in register, different in subject matter, different in the degree to which certain kinds of private information can move through the room without requiring the speakers to perform indifference to it. You are aware of this, working there, in the way you are aware of many things about the parlour that are not precisely in the job description, but that are part of the work. You understand that what you are doing on Saturday morning is not only setting hair. You are maintaining a kind of social infrastructure that does not have a formal name and that nobody has asked you to maintain, but that exists because you and Doris and the parlour itself create the conditions for it every week, reliably, at the same address, with the same appointment book and the same chemical smell and the same conversation happening in the same warm, intimate space. And the women who come in are coming in not only because their hair needs to be done, but because the space and the time and the particular quality of attention available. There are things they have built their Saturday around, things that are part of the structure of their week, in ways that they probably could not articulate fully, but that they would notice immediately if they were gone. The beauty parlour was, in this sense, doing something that the post-war suburban landscape was conspicuously bad at providing, which was a consistent, reliable, low-stakes social space for women that existed outside the domestic sphere, and that required nothing of them except showing up and allowing someone to take care of something. The suburbs were organised around the private rather than the public, around the individual house and the individual yard and the individual family unit rather than around the kind of informal public gathering spaces that towns had historically maintained, and that the post-war expansion of residential neighbourhoods had, in many places, failed to replicate. The beauty parlour was one of the few places in that landscape that functioned as a genuine public room for women, a place where you went and were seen and had a conversation and were part of a social world that was bigger than your own kitchen, and the fact that you also got your hair done there was partly incidental, partly the economic mechanism by which the space could exist and be maintained, but never the whole story of why you came. You understood this without theorising about it, the way you understood the mixing ratio for setting lotion, through observation and repetition, and the accumulated evidence of what you saw every Saturday, in the faces of the women who walked in and the faces of the women who walked out, which were not the same faces. The women who walked in were women with their week on them, with their Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday still present in the set of their shoulders and the way they held their handbags and the women who walked out were the same women with something slightly different in their posture, some small portion of the week's accumulation having been put down somewhere in the parlour and left there, the way you might put down a bag you've been carrying and forget for an hour that it was ever there. That is not nothing. That is in fact something quite significant. And you were the one providing it every Saturday, reliable as the appointment book and the dryer timer and the Maytag turning in someone's basement across town, part of the infrastructure of a way of life that was going to change significantly before the decade was out. And that was, for now, exactly what it was. Doris, walking out beside you at 5:20, has her coat fully buttoned before she reaches the door, which is the habit of someone who has been cold enough times to not give the cold any extra opportunity. She mentions, without particular emphasis, that Mrs. Kozlowski had a bruise on her forearm today that she covered with her sleeve when she noticed Doris looking. You both know what this observation contains, and neither of you says anything more about it, because there is nothing more to say, and nothing that saying more would accomplish, only the noting of it, the quiet, professional witness of a thing seen and registered by the people whose work put them in a position to see it, and then the cold air outside and the long walk to where the cars are parked, and the Saturday evening ahead, and the things that need to be done before Monday. This is also part of the work, the seeing, the registering, the quiet acknowledgement between two women who have spent a Saturday inside a space where women are honest in ways they are not always able to be elsewhere, and who carry that honesty with them as they lock the door and walk away, not as gossip, not as information to be deployed, but as the specific weight of having paid attention to something that mattered, which is its own kind of service, its own kind of quiet professional obligation, the one that does not appear in any licensing requirement or training program, but that the work demands of you regardless, and that you give, every Saturday, as steadily as the setting lotion, and the correctly timed dryer, and the gentle hand on fine silver hair. You drive home with the radio on. The evening news, or something like the evening news, a man's voice talking about something in Washington, or somewhere in the world that is not this town and not this Saturday, and you listen to it without quite hearing it, because you're thinking about dinner, and whether the potato casserole from yesterday will extend to tonight, and whether the children have been manageable for your sister who came to sit with them in the afternoon, and whether the October air is cold enough to mean that the furnace will need looking at before winter, and all of these thoughts are present at once in the particular way of a person at the end of a long day of work, when the mind begins to release its professional focus and return to the domestic orbit, and the domestic orbit, as always, has plenty for you to do. Saturday is not over when you leave the parlour. Saturday is never quite over. It is only shifting from one kind of work to another, the paid kind to the unpaid kind, the work that happens in public to the work that happens at home, and both of them are real, and both of them have requirements that do not adjust themselves to your level of tiredness. But driving home with the radio on, and the October dark coming in through the car windows, you are also, for just a few minutes, in no particular space, not at the parlour and not yet at home, in the specific freedom of transit, and you take that few minutes the same way you take the October light on the laundry line, not with drama, not with the weight of what it is, but simply as a moment that is briefly yours before the next thing begins. What the beauty parlour and the kitchen and the good housekeeping test kitchen all had in common, what they were all participating in without anyone having chosen to make them participants, was a cultural project of the post-war era that is worth naming directly before we close tonight's chapter. The project was the production of an image, not one specific image, not one magazine photograph or one advertising campaign, but a sustained, widely distributed, commercially motivated image of what domestic life in prosperous post-war America looked like, felt like, and required of the women at its centre. The image was not wholly false. The kitchens were real, the routines were real, the expertise and the competence and the genuine satisfactions of the work were real. But the image was selected, composed, and lit to emphasise certain elements of that reality, and to exclude others, and the elements excluded were the ones that might make the image uncomfortable, which is to say, the ones that made the work visible as work rather than as the natural expression of feminine aptitude. Understanding that project, understanding who built it and why and what it cost the women inside it, does not require condemning the women inside it. They were doing what made sense to do in the circumstances they found themselves in, with the tools and expectations and constraints of their specific historical moment, and many of them did it well, with real competence and real satisfaction, and a quiet daily expertise that deserved considerably more acknowledgement than it received. The project they were embedded in is worth examining and naming honestly. The women who are embedded in it are worth understanding with generosity, not because generosity is the comfortable choice, but because it is the accurate one. Both things are true, and holding both of them at once is how you actually see the 1950s Saturday morning, rather than the image of it. There is a photograph that appeared in a major American women's magazine in approximately 1952, one of many thousands of similar photographs published in that decade, that shows a woman in a kitchen. The kitchen is impeccable. The woman is impeccable. She's wearing a dress with a fitted bodice and a full skirt, a small pearl earring visible at her ear, her hair set in smooth waves, her lipstick a deep clean red, and she's smiling at a pie. Not at the camera, at the pie. It is a specific kind of smile, warm and proprietorial, the smile of someone who has accomplished something and is fully at ease in the accomplishment, and the pie on the counter in front of her is equally impeccable, a perfect lattice crust browned to a degree that suggests both competence and intuition, surrounded by a kitchen that shows no evidence of the process that produced it, no flour on the counter, no drips on the stove, no used bowls in the sink. This photograph is a lie of a specific and interesting kind. Not a simple lie, not a fabrication. The woman is real, the kitchen is real, the pie exists. But everything about the way the photograph was composed, lit, and selected for publication was designed to show you something that was true in the way that only the most carefully arranged things can be true, which is to say, true at the surface and organised to prevent examination of what lies beneath. The examination is worth doing. What does a Saturday morning routine in a 1950s household actually contain, stripped of the magazine photography and the good housekeeping feature, and the cheerful illustration in the department store advertisement? What does it look like, that routine, when you apply to it the same attention that the magazine claimed to apply to product testing, rigorous, honest, undeterred by the inconvenience of the findings? It looks like fatigue. That is the first thing. The 1950s housewife did not wake up rested in the general case, because she went to bed after her husband and before her children, and had been on her feet for the better part of the day preceding the night, and the nights were not always peaceful because children are not always peaceful, and the concerns that attend a household do not suspend themselves for sleep. The exhaustion of the 1950s housewife was a structural feature of her existence rather than a personal failure, built into the daily schedule by the volume and timing of what was required of her, and no amount of cheerful magazine copy or efficient kitchen design eliminated it, because the design of kitchens in that era, however modern by the standards of the previous generation, was not designed to reduce labour. It was designed to increase the standard of what labour was expected to produce. This is one of the central paradoxes of post-war domestic life, and it was noticed, though not named in quite this way, by the women living inside it. The arrival of the washing machine did not reduce the amount of time American women spent on laundry. The research on this point is now fairly extensive, having been examined by historians of domestic technology over several decades, and the finding is consistent. As washing machines became available in American households through the 1940s and 50s, the amount of time women spent on laundry did not decrease correspondingly. In many cases, it increased. The reason is not difficult to understand once you look at it squarely, which is that the availability of a washing machine changed the standard of cleanliness that was expected, which is to say the standard that women expected of themselves and that the culture around them reinforced, and a higher standard of cleanliness required more washing rather than less. And so the labour-saving device created through the mechanism of raised expectations approximately as much labour as it saved. The same pattern appeared across the domestic sphere with some consistency. Vacuum cleaners did not reduce the time spent cleaning floors when the standard for clean floors rose to meet the machine's capacity. Electric stoves and refrigerators did not reduce cooking time when the available repertoire of things that could be cooked expanded to fill the capacity the technology created. The refrigerator made it possible to keep more fresh food on hand, which was genuinely useful, but it also made it possible, and therefore expected, to serve a greater variety of fresh food at more meals, and preparing that variety required time, the same time that the refrigerator was theoretically saving by eliminating the daily trip to the market that had been the previous generation's routine. The magazine photography never showed this. The magazine photography showed the result: the impeccable kitchen, the perfect pie, the smiling woman in the fitted dress. What it systematically excluded was the process, the hours, the specific physical cost of the routine, the three-stair navigation in cold slippers, the basement with the wringer washer, the 45 minutes on knees with a brush in the bathroom grout, the constant cycling between tasks that had to be managed simultaneously, the bread rising while the laundry turned, while the pie crust rested, while the children needed something, and the husband returned from the garage to inquire about lunch. None of this appeared in the photograph. The photograph could not contain it without becoming a different kind of photograph, one that no magazine of that era was prepared to publish, because the photograph that showed the actual process would have been an uncomfortable document rather than an inspiring one, and magazines in that era did not intend to make their readers uncomfortable about the conditions of their own lives. What the magazines were selling, in the most honest analysis of what was happening in their pages, was not information about how to keep a house. They were selling a version of domestic life that was aspirational, in the specific sense that it showed the destination without the journey, the result without the cost, the surface without the structure. And American women in the 1950s bought this version in enormous numbers, not because they were deceived by it in any simple way, but because the aspirational image served functions that the accurate image could not serve. It organized the work towards something, provided a picture of what success looked like, created a standard that gave direction to the otherwise endless and undifferentiated flow of domestic tasks. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. There is a study conducted in the early 1960s by sociologist Helena Lopata and published in her book Occupation, Housewife, that asked American women directly about how they experienced the work of keeping house, and the findings were rather different from what the magazines had suggested. Most of the women Lopata spoke with experienced housework not as a fulfilling creative endeavour, which was the magazine version, nor as intolerable drudgery, which was the emerging feminist critique of the early 1960s, but as something more complicated and more human than either, something that contained genuine satisfactions and genuine tedium and genuine pride and genuine frustration in proportions that varied by the day and by the task and by the circumstances of the particular woman doing the work, and that did not resolve neatly into either the positive image or the negative one. They found meaning in specific aspects of the work. The baking was satisfying in ways the dusting was not. The cooking produced something that was consumed and appreciated. The care of children was exhausting, and also, in specific moments, a source of something that most of the women Lopata interviewed would not have called joy, but that was not far from it. The pleasure of competence applied to something that mattered. The specific deep satisfaction of a thing done well for someone who needed it done. These were real experiences, and they were genuinely positive, and they deserved to be taken seriously as genuine goods of domestic life. But the women also reported the invisibility, the feeling that the work, once done, was simply the baseline, the floor below which things would deteriorate, but above which nothing particular was expected to be noticed or acknowledged. The clean house was not commented upon. The dinner was eaten, and the dishes were washed, and the morning arrived, and the house was again the same house it had been the previous morning, requiring the same things of the same person in the same proportions, and the doing of all of it constituted no particular event in anyone's accounting of the day. It was the condition of the house's existence, rather than an achievement, that could be credited to someone, and the person who was the condition of the house's existence was accordingly neither credited nor particularly seen. This invisibility had a specific structure in the post-war era that was different from, and in some ways more complete than, the invisibility of domestic labour in previous generations. In previous generations, the domestic labour of women had been invisible in the sense that it was not acknowledged or compensated, but it had not been invisible in the sense of being actively hidden behind an elaborate image of effortlessness, because the image did not yet exist. The technology that created the image, the printing press improvements, the photography, the colour reproduction that allowed the gleaming kitchen to appear in its full aspirational glory on a magazine page, was itself a product of the mid-20th century. The gap between the official image and the lived reality was not simply the old gap between ideal and actual. It was a new and specifically modern kind of gap, one that was manufactured and maintained with considerable commercial investment, because the commercial investment in maintaining the image was one of the things that sold magazines and products, and the particular vision of domestic life that those magazines and products were built around. The products are worth examining for a moment, because the Saturday morning list in a 1950s household was not just a list of tasks. It was also a list of products, and the products were not neutral objects but carriers of a set of expectations about what the house should be and what the woman responsible for it should be able to achieve. The Tide in the yellow box on the basement shelf existed not just as a cleaning product, but as evidence that the laundry would be done to a standard that Tide's advertising had helped establish. A standard of whiteness and brightness and cleanliness that was specific to the post-war era, and that the advertising industry had worked hard to make feel natural and inevitable rather than constructed and contingent. The wringer washer itself, the Maytag in the basement, was sold on the basis of its labour-saving capacity, but required, as noted, a degree of active participation that made the labour-saving primarily a matter of removing the human-powered scrubbing that had preceded it rather than eliminating the labour category of laundry entirely. The woman operating the wringer washer on Saturday morning was still doing laundry. She was doing it differently, and the results were better, and the physical demand was lower in certain respects, but the management of the machine, the sorting, the soaking, the running of loads in order, the wringer operation with its hazards, the hanging and drying and ironing that followed, these remained substantially as they had been, organised by the same person around the same schedule, accomplished by the same pair of hands on the same Saturday morning. The ironing is worth a separate mention, because the ironing was the part of the Saturday list that most clearly illustrated the relationship between the official image and the actual requirement. The post-war era was the era of synthetic fabrics arriving alongside natural ones, the era of new finishes and new weaves, and also, importantly, the era before no-iron fabrics had become widely available and accepted. Everything in a 1950s household that came out of the wash and that was made of cotton, which was most things, required ironing. Shirts, dresses, tablecloths, pillowcases, handkerchiefs, children's clothes, house dresses, the blouses that went under the good suits. The ironing pile was a permanent feature of the domestic landscape of that era, a physical record of the gap between the finished image and the work required to produce it, visible every week in the basket of wrinkled things waiting to become smooth, accumulating through the week, never quite fully resolved because there was always more arriving before the previous pile was complete. The women who did this ironing did not iron in the fitted dresses and pearl earrings of the magazine photographs. They ironed in their house dresses, in the practical cotton shifts that were the working clothes of domestic life, designed to be comfortable and washable and not to show the activity that happened in them. The house dress was itself evidence of the gap, an entire category of garment that existed because the work of the house required clothing that was not the clothing worn for any public purpose, not the good dress for church and not the casual dress for shopping, and not the house dress the advertising photograph showed, but the actual house dress, worn and washed and slightly faded, the clothes in which the grout got scrubbed and the wringer operated and the bathroom floor mopped, the clothes that were not photographed. What was photographed, again and again, with remarkable consistency across the decade, was the moment after. The clean house, the finished pie, the set table, the woman who had done all of it, and who stood now, in her good dress with her lipstick on, having somehow arrived at this moment without displaying any evidence of the process, radiant and unrumpled in a kitchen that showed no sign of having been worked in, only of having been, somehow, magically, arranged. The magic, of course, was work. Specific, physical, repetitive, expert, largely invisible work done by real women on real Saturday mornings who were not wearing pearl earrings and who were not smiling at their pies with the photogenic ease of the magazine image, who were instead watching the clock on the dryer timer and calculating the ironing pile against the afternoon appointments and listening for the baby and trying to remember whether they had ordered more Tide because the box was running low. All of it at once, all of it every Saturday, all of it before noon, all of it without a photograph and without a seal of approval, and without a great deal of acknowledgement from anyone who was not also doing the same work in their own kitchen, on their own Saturday morning, and who understood, therefore, without being told exactly how much it all cost. That understanding, shared among women who were doing the work, was real. It constituted a kind of solidarity that the official image of domestic life did not acknowledge, but that was present nonetheless. In the conversations at the beauty parlour under the dryers, in the exchange over the backyard fence while the laundry dried, in the look between two women at church, when the sermon on the dignity of homemaking reached a certain level of eloquence about a dignity whose precise texture the preacher had not. It was gently apparent, experienced personally. The women who did the work knew what the work was. They did not need a photograph to tell them. They needed perhaps only the occasional acknowledgement that the photograph was not the whole story, that behind the impeccable kitchen and the smiling woman and the perfect pie was a real person who had been awake since 6 and whose feet hurt and who had done everything necessary and more and who had done it as she always did before the morning was over. The labour economists who have examined the post-war era in retrospect and who have tried to assign an economic value to the unpaid domestic labour that 1950s housewives were performing arrive at numbers that are genuinely striking. When you add up the market value of the services provided by a full-time housewife in that era, cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, shopping, household management, the figure reaches into the tens of thousands of dollars annually in contemporary terms, a significant economic contribution that appeared nowhere in any accounting of household income because the accounting systems of the era were not designed to see it. This was not a neutral design choice. It reflected and reinforced a set of assumptions about whose labour counted as labour, whose time had market value, whose contribution to the household economy was worth quantifying, and the assumptions were not evenly distributed. The women whose labour was not quantified understood in general that it was not quantified. This created a specific kind of economic vulnerability, particularly visible in cases of divorce or widowhood, where a woman who had spent years building and maintaining a household found that the years of work she'd contributed to the family's well-being were not, in the legal and economic sense, an asset she could claim, a contribution that translated into rights, a form of labour that the systems around her recognised as having been done. The woman was simply, in the accounting, a dependent, her contribution invisible in the same way her house dress was invisible, not photographed, not recorded, not valued in any of the official ways that value was assigned. The feminist writers who began articulating these criticisms in the early 1960s were looking at the same facts that the women in the kitchens had been living with for years. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, described what she called the problem that has no name, the vague, formless dissatisfaction that she found in interviews with educated women who had done everything the magazine told them to do and who found themselves, at the end of Saturday mornings completed and dinners made and children raised and houses cleaned, experiencing something that the official image of their lives had no category for, because the official image only had categories for contentment and for the kind of specific domestic problems that could be solved by a better product or a more efficient technique. Dissatisfaction with the structure of the life itself, with the invisibility built into it, with the gap between the impeccable magazine kitchen and the real one, was not a category the image had been designed to hold. This is not to say that the women of the 1950s were uniformly miserable, which is both false and unfair to their actual experience. Many of them found genuine satisfactions in aspects of domestic life that the feminist critique, in its necessary corrective energy, sometimes failed to take fully seriously: the genuine pleasure of baking, the real satisfaction of a well-run household, the meaning found in raising children, the specific deep rewards of competence applied to complex domestic work. These were real experiences and they deserved to be taken seriously as the real goods that they were. But they coexisted with the structural invisibility and the structural economic disadvantage and the particular exhaustion of work that was never finished and never adequately credited. And all of these things were present in the same kitchen at the same time, in the same person standing at the back door in October looking at clean sheets on the line, The 1950s housewife was not a simple figure, which is also the reason she continues to be interesting. She was a person navigating a specific historical moment with the tools and the expectations and the constraints of that moment, doing work of genuine importance and genuine skill under conditions that asked a great deal of her and acknowledged rather little, producing results that were real and solid and good and that formed the material foundation of family life in that era, and doing all of it for the most part before noon on Saturday. What the magazine photograph captured was the surface of something true. The kitchen was clean, the pie existed, the work had been done, The photograph was honest about all of that. What it declined to show was what it had cost to make it true, who had paid that cost, in what currency, over how many Saturday mornings, in a house dress that was not photographed, on feet that were talking quietly to themselves by mid-morning, while the children were fed and the laundry turned and the bread rose under its cloth and nobody was there to see any of it happening, only to arrive later and find it done. The woman in the photograph smiled at her pie because the pie was real, and she had made it, and it was good. The smile was not manufactured. But the conditions under which the photograph was taken, the careful lighting and the fitted dress and the absence of the evidence of process, those were manufactured carefully with commercial intention to produce an image rather than a record, an aspiration rather than a document. And the gap between the two is where the real story of American domestic life in the 1950s lives, in the detail and the texture and the accumulated small weight of work done in the margins of official visibility, in the cold basement and the bathroom floor, and the wringer's careful operation, and the grout brush, and the ironing pile that never quite emptied, and the quiet satisfaction, available to anyone who did the work, of having done it, of knowing it was done, of standing at the back door in October air and looking at clean sheets on the line and knowing exactly what it took to get them there. There are specific domestic practices from the 1950s Saturday morning that have fallen so far out of living memory that they require some reconstruction to understand, and the reconstruction is worth doing because the practices are both interesting in themselves and useful for understanding the particular texture of work that the Saturday list actually contained. The Murphy oil soap deserves its own moment, for instance, because it is one of those products so embedded in the domestic culture of its era that any woman who kept house in the 40s and 50s knows its smell the way she knows her own address. Murphy oil soap was developed in the early 20th century, a simple formulation of vegetable oil-based soap diluted in water, and it became the standard cleaning solution for wooden floors, wooden furniture, and almost any surface that required cleaning without stripping. And its smell was the smell of floors being cleaned in a way that the synthetic detergents of later decades never quite reproduced. A smell that is warm and slightly sweet, and that carries an enormous amount of sensory memory for anyone who grew up in houses where it was used. The Saturday floor scrubbing with Murphy oil soap and a bucket and a rag was a ritual as distinct and specific as the bread baking, something you could identify blind, and the floors that resulted from it had a particular quality that was different from the results of later floor cleaning products, less aggressively clean, more warmly maintained. The difference between a floor that has been polished and a floor that has been cared for. The wax that went on after the Murphy soap deserves its own moment as well, because waxing the kitchen floor was part of the Saturday routine in many households, a step that came after the mopping and the drying, and that produced the shine in the magazine photographs, the gleam on the linoleum that caught the morning light and that distinguished the properly maintained floor from the merely clean one. The wax in the 1950s was typically a paste wax applied by hand on hands and knees with a cloth, worked into the floor surface in circular motions and then buffed, also by hand, with a second cloth until the surface reflected light. It was physical work of a specific kind, requiring sustained pressure and repetitive motion, applied to an entire floor surface, and it produced an immediate visible result that had a quality the later self-waxing products did not quite replicate. The floor, after paste waxing, was not just clean. It was luminous, in a word that sounds too grand for a kitchen floor, but that is nonetheless the accurate description of what good paste waxing did to linoleum in morning light. Bluing is another product from the Saturday laundry that has largely passed from use and that requires explanation for anyone who did not grow up using it. In the era of the wringer washer and the natural light line drying, keeping white fabrics genuinely white over repeated washings was a technical challenge that the washing machines of the era did not fully solve on their own. White fabric, washed repeatedly in the slightly mineral water that came from most household taps in the 1950s, tended to yellow, and the yellowing was cumulative, barely visible in any single wash, but building over the course of months into a dingy quality that was the opposite of the brilliant white that the detergent advertisements promised. Bluing was the solution, a small amount of blue pigment added to the final rinse water, which counteracted the yellow tones optically, producing a white that looked brighter than the fabric technically was. It sounds counterintuitive, adding blue to produce white, and it is counterintuitive, and it is also one of those small domestic techniques that required knowing about and that produced a result sufficiently different from not knowing about it that the women who knew it regarded the knowledge with a particular quiet ownership. The whites came out right. They knew why. The process was correct. The starch is worth mention as well, because starching laundry in the 1950s was not optional in the way it became in later decades. Starched shirts did not simply look better. They were expected to look a particular way, and the expectation was specific enough and enforced by social convention firmly enough that the difference between a well-starched collar and an insufficiently starched one was a legible social signal about the household that had produced it. The liquid starch came in a bottle and was added to the rinse water or applied directly to the garment before ironing, and the ironing of a starched garment required a particular technique, a certain temperature and a certain pressure, and the occasional additional spray of water from a bottle or a damp cloth laid over the fabric, and the result, done correctly, was a shirt that held its shape and presented in the way that the social standards of that era required shirts to present, not as a luxury but as a baseline. These are the details that the magazine photographs did not need to show because the magazine photographs assumed them. They assumed that the reader knew what bluing was and how to use it and why. They assumed familiarity with paste wax and Murphy soap and the correct ratio of starch. The magazine was written for women who were already doing this work, who had learned it from their mothers the way their mothers had learned it from theirs, and who needed the magazine not to explain the fundamentals but to provide the improvements, the new products that worked better, the techniques that saved a step, the recipes that used the ingredients that were now available in the canned goods aisle that had not been available the previous decade. This is one of the ways in which good housekeeping was genuinely useful to women who were actually keeping house, and one of the ways in which its usefulness was different from what the advertising suggested. The advertising suggested that the magazine would tell you how to be the woman in the kitchen photograph. What the magazine actually did at its best was tell you how to do the specific things you were already doing more efficiently, with better results, using the current generation of products and techniques, and this was useful in the same way that a good trade manual is useful, not inspirational, not aspirational, but practically helpful to someone who is actually doing the trade. The question of aspiration versus practicality in the domestic publications of the 1950s is one that historians of the era have spent considerable time with, and the consensus view, to the extent there is one, is that the publications were doing both things at once, and that the two functions were not as separable as they might appear. The aspiration fed the practicality by creating standards toward which the practical advice was aimed. The practicality fed the aspiration by providing the technical means by which the aspirational image could be approached, never quite reached, because the aspirational image was always slightly ahead of where the practical advice could get you, which is of course the commercial function of aspiration. It keeps you buying the next issue, the next product, the next iteration of the advice that will finally close the gap between your kitchen and the kitchen in the photograph. The gap, of course, never fully closed because the gap was structural, not technical. No amount of correct paste waxing or perfectly calibrated bluing was going to produce a kitchen that looked like the magazine photograph, because the magazine photograph was taken with professional lighting and professional styling, and was selected from a large number of exposures for the one that showed the kitchen most flatteringly, and because the real kitchen had children in it, and a husband and a dog in some cases, and the residue of actual daily life in all cases, and actual daily life is not photogenic in the way that carefully arranged professional. Still photography is photogenic, and the gap between them was not a technical problem. It was a different thing entirely. It was the gap between a life and the image of a life, between the experience and the representation of the experience, between what it felt like to be in the kitchen at 6:15 on a Saturday morning and what it looked like in a magazine at noon on a Tuesday in a New York editorial office. And those two things are so far apart that no amount of work on the surface that connects them, no amount of paste wax or bluing or correctly starched collar was ever going to bring them into alignment. The woman in the kitchen knew this, in some bone-deep way, even when she didn't know she knew it. She knew the difference between the kitchen she was in and the kitchen she was reading about, and she went on doing the work of her kitchen anyway, because the work needed doing and because doing it well was its own argument for its own value, independent of any photograph. And that, I think, is where we ought to leave tonight, in the October air, with the clean sheets. We began this evening inside a Saturday morning that most of us have never personally inhabited, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and bread and the cold that leaked in from the basement stairs, with a woman who had been awake for almost 4 hours before her husband came downstairs for his eggs, who had already done more before 8 in the morning than many people do in a full Tuesday, and who was not finished, not close to finished, not even at the end of the thing that would be the end of her morning's work. We spent time with her in the basement and at the dough board, and on her knees in the bathroom and on the back porch in the October light, and I hope what came through, what I was trying to get at in all of that specific accumulated detail, is that the work was not small, it was not simple. It was skilled and demanding and organised and expert, and it went on being all of those things every Saturday morning for years, unremarked upon by any publication that did not also need to sell her something. We spent time with Good Housekeeping because if you want to understand the gap between the official image of that Saturday morning and the reality of it, the magazine is a good place to look, being both an honest attempt to take domestic work seriously and a commercial operation that had very specific reasons to present domestic work in a certain light. The women in the Good Housekeeping test kitchens were real professionals doing real work, and the work they did reached real readers who used it to do their own work better, and none of that cancels out the commercial complications any more than the commercial complications cancel out the genuine usefulness. And holding all of those things at once is what honest history requires. We spent time at the beauty parlour, in your hands and Doris's hands, and the particular space of a Saturday that belongs to women in a way that not enough spaces in that era did, where the conversations moved through the warm chemical air and the dryer hoods and the sound of the setting lotion being worked through wet hair. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. And where the social fabric of a town was maintained and repaired and reinforced in ways that the official social institutions of the era rarely gave women the structures to do. The beauty parlour was a women's space in an era short on women's spaces, and the women who worked there and the women who came there created something together that was greater than hair, greater than a service industry, something closer to a weekly assertion that the social lives of women were worth maintaining, and that the people who maintained them were doing something that mattered. And we spent time with the photograph, with the impeccable kitchen and the smiling woman and the perfect pie, and we looked at what was behind it, not to diminish the pie or the woman or the kitchen, none of which deserve diminishing, but to see them more clearly, to understand the photograph as the particular kind of truth it was, which is to say, a surface truth, the truth of the result without the truth of the process, the image of the destination without the image of the road that led there, the cold basement and the ringer's careful management and the knees on the bathroom tile, and the 4 hours before anyone else was awake. What connects all of tonight's stories, what I want you to carry with you into whatever sleep is coming, is something simpler than all of that analysis. It is the fact of competence. Real, accumulated, expert, practiced competence applied to work that mattered, and that was done well, and that formed the material foundation of family life in mid-century America, by real women who were not in their fitted dresses and pearl earrings at 6 in the morning, who were in their house dresses on the cold basement steps, who learned the mixing ratio by feel and smell, who knew when the bread was right by the sound of the crust releasing, who understood without being told that the third stair creaked and that you stepped to the right on it, who knew which dryer rod size produced the curl that Mrs. Halverson had been wearing since 1946, and who knew all of these things the way you know things that you have done enough times that the doing has become simply who you are. There is something in the specificity of that knowledge that I find genuinely moving in the late hours when I'm thinking about it. Not the image of it, the actual knowledge itself, stored in the hands and the body and the accumulated memory of 100 Saturday mornings, the knowledge of exactly how much Crisco to cut into the flour and exactly when to stop and exactly what the dough should feel like when it is right. Knowledge that does not appear in any record and was not certified by any institution and did not come with a wage attached to it, and that simply existed, in the hands and the body and the daily and weekly practice of women who kept households in a particular country, in a particular century, and who did it, as a matter of course, before noon. That knowledge was real. Those women were real. The work was real. And somewhere, in a kitchen that does not smell of coffee because the coffee has already been made and drunk, in a house where the laundry is not in the basement because the laundry is already done and hanging, a woman who has been on her feet since before the sun committed to rising is sitting down for the first time since morning. Maybe at the kitchen table, maybe at the back door, looking at the yard, maybe in the good chair in the living room, in the particular quiet of a house where the children are occupied and the afternoon has not yet arrived at its next requirement. Maybe she has a cup of something. Maybe she does not. Maybe she is just sitting. Whatever she has done this morning is done. It will not stay done. Tomorrow it will begin to need doing again, and Monday will bring its own list, and Tuesday will bring the continuation, and the weeks will move as they do in that life, in cycles of completion and beginning that have no final endpoint, only the rhythm of the cycle itself, and the small satisfaction available every time the cycle completes of knowing that it was done, and done well, and that the household is as it should be for now, for this moment, for the afternoon ahead. Let that be enough tonight. Let the October air come in at the edges. Let the clean sheets do their work. Let the bread cool on the rack in a kitchen that smells of a morning well spent. And let the woman at the back door in her house dress stay there a moment longer, looking at her laundry in the sun, before the afternoon list begins. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you are comfortable. I hope whatever your own week has been, it has brought you to a point where the rest that is coming feels earned. And I will be back with another evening just like this one, for the nights when the past feels like a warm room to spend some time in. Take good care of yourselves. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.